values. They're to do with object-based values. And again, they do not polymorph. So let's take a look at the array data declaration type. This means the function can return an array, which could just be a standard array like so, which will have a 0 index base. And also, you can return an associative array. So you could say the key hello is equal to the value 20. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and hit refresh. And there again, you can return associative arrays as well. Now also on top of that, you can set a data type declaration to be of a certain object type. So let's go ahead and create a class called myObj. And we're just going to open and close the parentheses, and in there you would have your properties and methods. So my class can build objects, and what I can do is I can say, right, this function is going to return an object or an instance of myObj. So this function must return an object that comes from that class. So now I can say new myObj. So that is now a new object that came from that class, and that is now acceptable here for this data type declaration. So I'm going to save that and hit refresh, and you'll notice it did an error. However, if I created another class, so we'll say cake, well now if I create a new instance, a new object from the cake class, then what it's going to say is, okay, you are returning an object, but the object didn't come from the myObj class. So if I hit refresh now, you'll notice that it says this function must return an instance of, meaning an object created by the myObj class. And also don't forget, you can have interfaces as well. So I can say an interface, and we can say register. So what an interface will do is check to make sure a class has certain methods on it and properties as well. And then I can implement that interface. So I can say this class implements the register interface. And then I can say that the object that is being returned must have that register applied. So that object must come from a class that implements a certain interface. So I can say register as well, so you don't have to directly mention the class. And if I go ahead and save this, I'll still get an error, because don't forget, we have the cake object being returned, an instance of cake, and that doesn't implement the interface of register. So if I was to change that to myObj, well, this object comes from this class which does implement this interface. So if I save it and hit refresh, you'll notice I don't get an error. Now, don't forget, we're working with objects here. And what are functions in PHP? Well, they are first-class citizens, meaning they are treated as objects. Functions are objects, essentially. So we can actually get rid of all this for the time being, and we can say that this function must return another function by, again, setting this to callable. So whenever we see callable, what do you call? You can only call functions. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say, right, well, this function is going to return a new function. And this can be echo hello. So now that we are saying this function must return another function, let's hit refresh. And then you'll notice it has allowed this. You can't just return a standard object anymore. So if I say array 2300, save it, hit refresh, you'll notice it's a fatal error because it must be a callable. It must return a function. And this is actually really good because when you create an API and so forth, you may want your function to do something. So I'm going to say do something and then call back a function, and then we will pop in a line break. So now when I save this and hit refresh, you'll notice my original function that I called produced the string, and then once it's finished, what it can do is it can call back a function, so it can have extended functionality via the API. So that's a really nice feature that you have. Now finally, we have the self-declaration type. Now this declaration type can only be used within a class. So I'm going to create a new class and we're going to give it the name myObj, and then we're just going to paste this in and encapsulate our data return function. So now this function is a method, and we're going to say that this function can only return an object that came from the same class, came from itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of that. And we'll also get rid of this as well, and I shall say that what we're going to return is whatever's passed into the object argument. Now again, I can use the self-declaration type on the argument itself, but I'm not going to do that because I want this declaration type to take precedent here. So once we've done that, we also need to change the way that this is called. So we need to generate a new object first of all. So I'm going to create a new variable that's going to be equal to a new object that came from myObj, and then I'm going to target that object and call the data return method. So this class right here will then build an object, and then we can use the data return method that is within that object. And what we can do now is we can pass in an object. So let's go ahead and create a second object, and then we can go ahead and pass in a new instance of myObj. So as this right here is now assigned to this argument and is being returned, it won't error, and that's because this object came from itself. It came from this class. Let's go ahead and save that and hit refresh, and you'll notice it returned it and said this is an object that came from itself. But however, if I was to create a new class, so I'll say this will be the class of cake, and I'll just say, right, pass in a new cake instance or object that came from the cake class. Well, now it violates that data type, because what happens is it wants an object that came from itself to be returned from this function. And well, it's getting an object from the cake class. So there are your return type declarations now available on functions themselves.